So, hello, Bradley,
Hi,
or
Dave.
Brad.
Brad's fine.
Thank you for joining me. I should have had my headphones on earlier, but I want to welcome Brad Lepper here on the show. He is the senior archaeologist for, among other things, Serpent Mound. And Serpent Mound is a earthwork, and I'm going to let Brad talk about it here in a second. But it's been kind of in the news a little bit more, Serpent Mound, because of certain specials on TV. There's a lot of questions surrounding Serpent Mound. It's an amazing site. And so I want to start off our talk, Brad, with why don't you just describe to us physically what's on the ground, sizes, dimensions, style of Serpent Mound, and then I want to get into the origins of Serpent Mound.
Serpent Mound is probably the most iconic Indian mound in America. It's certainly the most widely recognized mound. And part of that's because it's something that's easily recognizable to people. It's a serpent. There's funny things going on at the head, but clearly it's a serpent. And that sort of familiarity is different from what you get at like the Hopewell earthworks that are these giant, geometrical figures that are like, what the heck is that supposed to be? People know it's a serpent. And it's led to a lot of misconceptions beginning, as far as I know, like in 1800, when the Reverend Landon West decided that it was not just any serpent, it was the serpent of the Garden of Eden. And it, in fact, marked the location of the Garden of Eden. And the serpent seems to have, in some people's imaginations, an oval in its mouth. And it's often referred to as an egg. But Landon West, the Reverend West, thought it was the apple of Eden. So he had this extraordinary idea that had much more to do with what was going on in his head than what was going on in the heads of the indigenous people. But this is the largest ancient serpent sculpture in the ancient world. It's 1,400 or more feet long if you follow
Okay.
its winding course. So it's gigantic. It's as big as almost any of the other kinds of animal effigy mounds that have been built in North America. And it's composed of earth that indigenous people, I think 1,000 years ago, excavated with pointed sticks and clamshell hose and deer shoulder blade hose and baskets, one after another, to create this really elegant and beautiful design of this ancient serpent. And I think there's more to it than just a serpent, which we can get into later.
Yeah. Okay. So it's a winding earthen mound, about 1,400 feet long. So that's about as long as a football field, maybe. Would you say?
Yeah, I think it's like 4,000 feet. No, what did I say
Or
originally?
okay, you said 1,400 feet
Yeah,
long.
yeah. I'm sorry, I just got confused. Yeah, it's about 1,400 feet long. Yeah, I don't. The football field's what, 100 yards divided
Yeah.
3,000.
So it's it's quite a bit longer than a standard football field.
Yeah,
You would say.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And it's this winding. For the people that don't know, and I'll pull up some images too. It's like a meandering, almost mound shape. And then how tall is it from the ground?
It's probably between 3 or 4 feet high, and it's been restored back in the 1800s because before it was preserved, part of it, at least part of it, got plowed down. So it's been restored to the dimensions recorded for it by the original surveyors, Ephraim Squire and Edwin Davis, back in the 1850s. And their map was published in the very first publication of the Smithsonian Institution back in 1848.
Okay. Cool. So it's been altered since its initial discovery. And I want to talk about, when was this thing originally, let's say, rediscovered by Euro-American settlers? And what shape was it in? Was it in a prairie? Was it covered in a forest?
Yeah, at the time of
Do you know?
discovery, it was what was recovered in a forest, and we're not exactly sure who discovered it. It must have been noticed by local people, but when it was reported to Squire and Davis and they came to survey it, they were expecting, based on their description, probably a hilltop enclosure with sort of bastions. But when they got there and mapped it out, they said, oh, these aren't bastions. These are the curves of the body of this giant serpent. So they were the first
So
ones.
what are bastions? What are
Bastion,
bastions?
well, if you've got a fort, they're the sort of the corners that allow you to defend that fort from three different angles, front, then
Okay.
the two sides. So they're features of fortifications that, sort of help you defend a fortified location.
Okay. So yeah, so they thought at first they were looking at maybe a base, some sort of old remnants of a fort. I know like Fort Ancient culture is defined by, that the remains, right, of what they thought was an ancient fort, right?
Yeah, this is just
Um,
a source of massive confusion that we should sort out right here, because the Fort
yeah, we
Ancient
should do it right
culture,
now.
yeah, the Fort Ancient
Hmm.
culture is named for the Fort Ancient earthworks, which were actually
That's what I'm talking about.
Hopewell. They were actually Hopewell earthworks built 2,000 years
Oh,
ago. People
got it.
thought at the time it was a fort and that it was ancient, so they called it Fort Ancient. It turns out the Fort Ancient enclosure, built 2,000 years ago, was a place of ceremony, not a fortification. It's 3.5 miles
Okay.
of walls. It's got an interior ditch instead of a moat on the outside. And there's more than like 80 gaps in the walls. So it would make a very bad fort. And the culture that came 1,000 years later built a small, or not a small, but a large village in the southern part of the fort. And when archaeologists were excavating there, they said, oh, this is not Hopewell. This is not Adena. This isn't any of the cultures we know of. And by convention in archaeology, cultures are named after the first site where the new culture is recognized. So this Fort Ancient village became the sort of the type site for the Fort Ancient culture, but they're not forts, and they didn't build the Fort Ancient earthworks.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying. So also for the listeners, I want to talk about your background a little bit, because you're bringing a lot of expertise on here for questions I think a lot of people have. So like including myself, but I do want to, there is evidence for palisade wall building. So forts, not necessarily prior to the Hopewell or Mississippian, but later on, some of these could be bastion walls in some instances, right?
Yeah,
Or
some
the
of the
remains of a palisade.
yeah,
Some could
there
be.
are Fort Ancient villages do have walls built around them and do have people buried in their cemeteries that have arrowheads stuck between the ribs. So during the Fort Ancient period, beginning at about 1,000 AD, there is seemingly warfare taking place.
Okay. Okay. And then, so how did you get involved in this research? I know you're the senior archaeologist for, I can't remember the world. What's the name of the organization
Well, the name of the
that you work
organization
for?
is the Ohio History Connection, and it used to be
Okay.
known
The
as the
Ohio.
Ohio Historical Society.
Okay. And you published quite a bit on these big earthen mound sites and the so-called Hopewell Road. I saw that you published a new article on, or a recent article on. So can you describe your expertise and background, and where'd you get your degrees, your PhD?
Yeah, I got my PhD from the Ohio State University, and I graduated from there in 1986. Spent a year doing what's called contract archaeology, where you're working for people that don't want you to find anything because it's going to be in the way of the road or something. And that wasn't much fun. So a job opened up at the Ohio History Connection, which was then the Ohio Historical Society. And I became the curator and site archaeologist for the Newark earthworks, which were Hopewell earthworks. Gradually, I moved up in the organization and I became the curator of archaeology, responsible for all the sites, really, or at least the archaeology of all the sites. So that's how I began to do research, not only on the Newark earthworks, the Octagon, the Great Circle, but also Serpent Mound and Fort Ancient.
Okay, so you're heavily involved in the work around it. You're familiar with the literature. You've been involved with helping to preserve and educate people in the public about the site. So you're on the ground, hands on. That's the point of this podcast: is get people. I don't want to get experts that have written about your work in a book. I want to get you to tell me about what happened. And I noticed. Luckily, you're here to talk to someone that's done a lot of radiocarbon dating. So I think we'll have, let's say, interesting discussions on the dating of Serpent Mound and bulk dating versus getting dates of terrestrial organic material, which I am very well aware of the issues surrounding that. But before we get into that, let's start from the beginning of, and I have this annoying light that is coming through my curtains. I need to adjust this, and it's just going to be like this while the sun is rising. I'm in Hawaii right now, and I'm talking on an East Coast time. It's very early in the morning here. Hold on just one sec. Okay, so where I want to start with this, we've had plenty of expertise on the field in the research literature. Let's set the stage. I want to focus on Serpent Mound in particular, and maybe we'll talk about other sites as well. But that seems to be kind of an interest for people right now with a special on Netflix and other things online. So the people that are tuning in probably are tuning in because they saw that this is Serpent Mound and they want to know like exactly how this thing was dated, how old it is. But let's start the stage. I liked how earlier you brought up how it was found when Euro-American settlers came in to the area. It was under trees. They thought it might have been the remnants of some old bastions, but it turns out that it's the Serpent Mound. This aligns with the worldview of the Bible, let's say. And so that kind of reinforces this myth because this serpent is found eating some sort of circular thing in its mouth, but it was interpreted as an apple. And then this kind of links in this whole set of baggage, let's call it, when you interpret the remains. Now, prior to that Euro-American settlement, who was in the area?
You mean the indigenous
who
people?
was settled in the indigenous? Let's do like a time machine. We're going to start with contact and then going back to, let's say, we're going to go back 1,000 years, then to 2,000 years. So at contact and just before contact, was the Serpent Mound earthwork actively being maintained by the indigenous people, or was it being overgrown by the forest? So if the forest is found there, wouldn't that suggest that it was maybe abandoned or lost, or at least not maintained?
Yeah, I suppose you could say it's not being maintained, although it very well still could have been revered and visited. And the indigenous groups in the area at that time, immediately pre-contact, would have included the Shawnee, probably the Miami as well.
And the Shawnee and Miami, were these groups that were pushed out of the East during the early contact period? There are a lot of displaced peoples from the East Coast. Were they there they were there?
No, yeah, they were there all. Well, what's difficult to know, and this is part of the problem of the history of the Ohio area, is there were indigenous people living there after sort of the Fort Ancient culture or coinciding with the end of the Fort Ancient culture. But Iroquois, who lived further east, like in New York and Pennsylvania and there, were involved in a trade network with Europeans. They were running out of deer and beaver furs. So they come into the Ohio Valley in what's called the Beaver Wars and drive out or kill the people living there so that they could claim it for and harvest the furs there. As their influence declined, some tribes were moving back to their homelands, and we think the Shawnee and Miami were examples of that. But some, like the Delaware, who lived in New Jersey and were pushed successively west by Europeans, come in later. So they're here at contact period as well. But again, they've been pushed successively west. So they were essentially newcomers to the Ohio Valley. And other tribes came in, the Seneca, the Potawatomi, others that may have been newcomers filling the vacuum left by the Iroquois, or they may have been people coming back to original homelands. And we just don't have that sorted.
Okay. I'm a little familiar I'm from Erie, Pennsylvania. The Erie's Indian tribe, or Erie's tribe, was supposedly wiped out by the Iroquois. And if you're familiar, but I know it was closely related group of people, like a language supposedly. But yeah, were they wiped out during this Beaver War period?
It may have even been soon before that. But yeah, they were an Iroquois group living on the extreme eastern end of Lake Erie. And I think earlier the Iroquois annihilated them. Well, then they're Iroquoian too,
okay,
so it's just different factions of Iroquoian-speaking peoples.
Yeah, that's what I remember. We used to go to these museums in grade school in Erie, and they would give us a story about, that was like the little spiel we got about the indigenous history of North America. That was it, by the way, for people out there. So we have a lot of work to do to get this sorted out. We have you said the Miami and the Shawnee. They seem to be, at least historically, in the area going back to prior, pre-Columbian, pre-contact times. These are then derived, those groups are probably derived from what culture would have been before that, would you say?
That's what the archaeologists call the Fort Ancient culture. And they occupied this area in southern Ohio and part of central Ohio that is most closely historically attached to the Miami in the west and the Shawnee in the east.
And when did this culture develop, and how is it characterized? What makes it different than other cultures?
Yeah, it seems to start around 1000 AD and it goes all the way up to like 1650. In the latest, those 1650s, 1600 sites do have European trade beads in them. So they are not encountering Europeans, but indigenous peoples further east as part of this almost continent-wide trade network that existed. The Fort Ancient culture people were acquiring trade beads through trade from other indigenous people. And sadly, that contact also included exposure to European diseases. So there were epidemics of smallpox, diphtheria, whooping cough, all kinds of things through the Ohio Valley before anybody there even saw a European. And so that's one of the reasons why these cultures were so damaged, were so hurt, that they probably weren't as able as they would have been to maintain a defense against the oncoming Europeans.
This is a story you see over and over again in North America during the contact period. And I think it's just recently that we've come to grasp, at least me, and I think the literature, the degree to which introduced diseases really affected the population demographics of North, South, and Central America long before anyone really witnessed what happened. There's these little bits, these little accounts, like in the Southeast through Florida, of kind of the pre-disease North American cultures. And it's sad. And yeah, that's part of the reason. It's kind of adds a little bit of a mystery to this whole thing because of that event, kind of almost like a lot of cultural memory loss, would you say? Do you think?
Yeah, I mean, and that's, I think, one of the reasons why when indigenous people were asked by Europeans who built the mounds, the most common answer they gave was like, we don't know. Or, they had folklore explanations. Another common explanation was, well, they're ancient forts built by our ancestors that had to be that big because they were battling supernatural monsters. So, I mean, clearly they're trying to understand these are giant walls. We build walls, but they're not so big. So our ancestors must have had a big reason for building bigger walls.
Got it. Okay, so if we take this narrative we're talking about, let's do this time. Let's keep going back in time. So we have the Shawnee, Miami. They kind of have been derived from the Fort Ancient culture. The Fort Ancient culture existed in the time before diseases, large, new, novel diseases really changed the demographics of Ohio and the area around Serpent Mound. Now we're, let's say, at 1,000 years ago, 900 years ago. Now take us back. Keep going back to another 1,000 years before that. How would you characterize the cultures of Ohio during that time?
Sure. So
about 2,000 years.
Yeah. So the Fort Ancient, they're essentially Mississippian peoples living in large villages that are walls around them. They're growing corn, beans, and squash. You go back to the next period back is called the Late Woodland period. It goes from about 900 back to, say, AD 400 or 500. And those are people that were beginning to start living in larger villages. Corn comes in at about 900, so that's pretty much coincident with the Late Woodland period. This is also when bows and arrows come in. But they're living in communities that maybe aren't quite as large as the Fort Ancient people. And that's kind of a transitional period, I guess, between the Fort Ancient and then what's called the Hopewell culture, which is from about AD 1, perhaps as early as AD 100, up to 500. And that's a big difference. because those people, they're not living in large villages. There's no evidence of warfare. They're these tiny little communities that are like homesteads are coming together at places like the Newark Earthworks, at places like the Hopewell Mound Group in Chillicothe, and these giant Hopewell Earthworks in large numbers to build these impossibly large enclosures and worship there. And at that time, this was probably the center of a great religion that extended from at least the Rocky Mountains to the Atlantic coast and from southern Canada to the Gulf of Mexico. And that's the extent of the influence of the Hopewell culture that was focused in southern Ohio. Before the Hopewell, the precursors of the Hopewell were what's called the Adena culture. And they're the ancestors of the Hopewell. They're building earthworks too. They're living in the same small communities, but their earthworks are very small, like a circle that's 200 feet in diameter that would have been the equivalent of a community church. And then conical burial mounds that were cemeteries, probably for a group of communities. Before them, and that's when we first get more or less somewhat sedentary communities. We have pottery. We have the beginnings of this trade network. Copper from Canada shows up in Adena sites, and it's the first construction of earthworks. Before the Adena, there's this very long, for thousands of years, it's called the Archaic period. And this is when people are hunters, fishers, and gatherers, living lightly on the land.
Can you define?
Go ahead.
Define those periods, the time periods again, the Adena to transition to Archaic, and then when in years BP, just for the listeners.
Yeah. I can do BC better, I think, because that's how I know them, but it's easy to make that.
Do BC.
Yeah. So the Fort Ancient, right before contact, is like AD 1000 up to 1650 or so. The Late Woodland is like AD 900 up to 1000 with some overlap, maybe even as early as 800. That the Late Woodland would go all the way to about 500 AD. So 500 AD to 900 AD. The Middle Woodland, which is the Hopewell culture, is from probably 100 BC or AD 1 up to about AD 400. And then the Adena go from that AD 1 or 100 BC all the way back to about 800 BC. And the Adena overlap with the Hopewell. So in some regions of Ohio, some regions of Kentucky, people continue to live in an essentially Adena way of life while the Hopewell is going on. So these aren't really stark boundaries, one between the two. So, and then after 800 BC, back to about 10,000 years ago, is what we call the Archaic culture. And these were hunter-gatherers living lightly on the landscape. And Ohio was such a rich environment that they could be hunter-gatherers for millennia. And people have this misconception. I know, like when I was in elementary school, I was taught that hunter-gatherers had it rough, and it wasn't later until they figured out that they could plant seeds and grow gardens that now we can be farmers. But in actual fact, hunter-gatherers have lots more leisure time than farmers. They don't want to be farmers. Farmers have to work their rear ends off. So they would have resisted becoming farmers for as long as they could. But then, because the population grew so much, hunter-gatherers need lots of land. So they hunt deer in this area, and when the deer get thin, they move to another valley and hunt deer there. And maybe several years later, come back to that same valley after the deer have been replenished. But when population gets high enough, you're running out of deer in your valley, so you move to the next valley, but there are already people there. So you have to go back and say, okay, well, we don't have very many deer to hunt, so now we have to hunt second-class resources or even third-class resources. And that's where farming comes from. The plants that turned into farming plants were like third-rate plants that they ended up focusing on and domesticating and sort of evolving into the plants that we know today. So that's the Archaic period. And then before that, from the 8,000 years BC, who knows how far back, at least 14,000, maybe even now 23,000, years ago. Those are what's called the Paleo-Indians, the first indigenous people, the first people to come into the Americas. And in the early part of that, they're hunting mammoths and mastodons, giant ground sloth. Later, they're hunting deer and so on. But really, the end of the Ice Age marks the end of the Paleo-Indian period and the beginning of the Archaic period.
So when in Ohio and near the Serpent Mound, in this time period, do we see the beginnings of, let's say, earthwork construction?
The beginnings of earthwork construction in Ohio starts at around 600 to 800 BC with the Adena culture.
With those small localized mounds, circular and conical mounds.
And at Serpent Mound, Serpent Mound is built on this sort of rocky peninsula that juts out into the Ohio Brush Creek Valley. There are 2 Adena burial mounds and remnants of a small Adena community of some kind, or maybe a special purpose site. So the Adena were on that landscape.
Okay. And so we have the, around, 800s BC, I think, 2 to 3,000 years ago, roughly speaking, we see the first beginnings of small mound building in Ohio. Then we get to Serpent Mound, and Serpent Mound is dated to a more recent period. And the dating has been, there have been people that have put out dates by Romaine, who claim that the earthen mound, Serpent Mound, is, 2,000 years old. And you published a new set of dates, and with a new line of reasoning, to argue that those dates that Romaine published are too old, and that the Serpent Mound is about 1,000 years old based on the dates that you had presented, along with corresponding iconography that coincides with the construction of Serpent Mound.
Yeah, but
so
let me just change that chronology, because it was in 1996 that the team that I was working with radiocarbon dated the site to the Fort Ancient culture. They got like 1,100, 1,000 years old dates for it. Before that, people like Frederick Putnam in the 1880s thought it was Adena. And then we changed all that by finding these dates that said they were Fort Ancient. Then Romaine and his team, who thought it still should be Adena, did their soil cores in the Serpent, got a bunch of dates, and all their dates clustered in the Adena period. So they were the ones that saying, oh no, Lepper and his other people were wrong. It's not Fort Ancient culture, it's Adena culture. And that's when I started bringing the iconography into it. Because you'd think whoever would built a giant serpent mound must have thought serpents were important in their whole culture. So it should be represented more.
Got it. Okay. And so maybe you just sort of did it, but I was trying to get to the point where could you summarize the history of dating Serpent Mound? And then I want to get into specifically, once we get that out of the way and, talk about that, I want to get into the dating that you did versus the bulk dating of Romaine and the underlying soil horizon. We can get into the weeds of that. But so first, you just did it again, but let's maybe like a brief summarization of the dating history of Serpent Mound and how they derive their dates. I mean, if it's a tree ring count, or is it a radiocarbon, is there just biblical correlation? And then, once we get to that, then we'll get to your reply in 2018 and this 2020 paper on the Mississippian iconography and how it may correspond with the serpent. Yeah. Anyway, go ahead. Start with the summary.
So the first archaeologist that comes to that landscape to study it is Frederick Ward Putnam with Harvard Peabody Museum. And he excavates all over the place. He excavates the burial mounds. There were 3 burial mounds. 2 of them are what we would now call Adena. Archaeologists had not identified those separate cultures when Frederick Putnam was working, but he recognized that they were a different culture. There was another burial mound on the site that we would now call Fort Ancient, and it was a much smaller mound. And then there was the Serpent. And then between the burial mounds and the Serpent, there was a big, broad, flat area, which he excavated, and it had a large Fort Ancient village. And then beneath it, there was evidence of a much, much smaller Adena occupation. So Putnam doesn't have radiocarbon dating. He's just looking who built mounds, who had the villages here. And he concludes that because the Fort Ancient culture, as we've talked about, was very closely related to the contemporary indigenous peoples, and those people were looked down upon as like savages. And so Putnam says, oh yeah, those people at that later occupation were, he doesn't use the word savages, but it's clearly a sort of there in the background. Those people were savages. They weren't building these giant monuments like Serpent Mound. That must have been built by the grander, older culture that was there, that built the two larger conical mounds. And so he was essentially saying what we would now say, that the Adena must have built it because they were a more evolved culture, and that the Fort Ancient represented sort of a de-evolution or something, a de-cultural evolution. And that's where things stood for a long time. And other archaeologists agreed. Later, my team came along. Actually, it's a great story. I had two amateur archaeologists, Robert Fletcher and Terry Cameron, approach me saying, we want to get dates for Serpent Mountain and establish it once and for all. When Putnam had excavated trenches through the circle, he never found any artifacts. So there was nothing that he could say, this is an Adena spear point, or this is a Fort Ancient culture arrowhead. Determine the age that way. But he did note that there was an ash layer at the bottom of the mound. And these guys, these two avocational archaeologists said, let's dig a trench, find that ash layer and date it. And that will provide a direct, irrefutable date, because that would have been a burning episode that took place immediately before mound construction. And I thought that's an awesome idea. So we partnered together. We used soil cores to find one of Putnam's old trenches. The goal here was not to dig more holes into the Serpent than were already there, not to damage it anymore. We found one of his trenches. We opened it up and widened it very carefully until we came to the intact profile. There was no ash layer. So what are we going to do? We took soil samples from two separate parts of the mound that were the most intact. Because we had exposed the whole profile, we could see where there were rodent burrows. So we avoided those. So we weren't getting any disturbed. Used flotation, which is where you put those soil samples in the water and agitate it, and charcoal particles float up. In both samples, identified charcoal fragments. We sent it to a paleoethnobotanist that told us there were white oak, and there was one other one, I think, but mostly white oak. We dated those separately with AMS dating, and they both came back with identical dates of like 920 AD, which is corrected to be like around 1,000, around 1,100. So we said, it's Fort Ancient. Then Bill Romaine had always thought in his publications before this that it was a Hopewell mound, because the Hopewell built such beautiful, elegant, large mounds. It must have been Hopewell. And so he was disappointed when we turned out that it was Fort Ancient. So he got a team together and said, let's do soil cores and we'll date the whole mound, get a lot of dates. And that's what they did. They put a bunch of soil cores in. They identified what they thought was the base of the mound. They say they have charcoal, and I have no doubt there were some charcoal fragments, but what they dated was bulk sediment that may have included charcoal fragments. And they got a bunch of dates that ranged from 300 BC to 600 BC. And they said, see, it's not Fort Ancient. It was originally built by the Adena. And at first I was like, well, okay, that's kind of interesting. But then as I started looking into it deeper, it's like, no, your radiocarbon dates are not precise. They're not accurate. And then I found this study that was published in the Norwegian Archaeological Review that found that soil core dates give dates that are way too old than what they should. And they found that, I think they were trying to date the spread of Christianity. And they had a bunch of dates for mounds that had been partially excavated where they dated charcoal from the main tomb. And they knew exactly how old those were. And then they were using core dates to date other mounds to increase their sample. And they were confused because a lot of those dates were coming back way too early, hundreds of years too early, maybe 1,000 years too early. And so they're saying, well, there's something going on here. So what they did, which was remarkable, they went back to some of the mounds that they had already securely dated, put soil cores in them, dated the stuff from the bottom of the soil core, and found that it was hundreds of years too old. So they demonstrated one of the big problems now is using bulk sediment samples, soil humates from the bottoms of mounds. It's unreliable, and it gives dates that are too old.
I've had this experience with lake sediments, and And there's been a huge debate. There's a ton of literature on these old dates versus, old dead carbon effect and dating discrete terrestrial macrofossils. So things that lived on land, breathe, they're in the carbon cycle, and then they burn, it stops and they're preserved, versus like just the goop at the bottom of the lake. And you put the dates next to each other, and yeah, the bulk dates will always be, if there's some sort of contamination with dead carbon, they'll be older. And the degree at which they're older is going to be affected by the amount of dead carbon in there. So when I saw that, I was like, wow, that's very strange. Remind me though, what's the chronology like for the timings of these dating? So the first dates that you worked on, where you proposed it's Fort Ancient, that was in the 90s?
Yeah, we did the excavation in 91, and the results were published in 96.
I think, was that the picture you had sent along as well?
Yeah, it was
of an excavation.
The profile of the excavation. We went much deeper than we needed to, partially because initially we were sure we'd identified the base of the mound, but then partly we wanted to get a sense of the whole geology too.
Okay. And then Romaine and colleagues published their dates in 2018, 2017?
Yeah, I think 2018, somewhere in there. I don't have that right.
Because your reply is 2018, if it's the same year as published.
Oh, it was probably the year before that then, yeah. But go ahead.
Okay, and then you published a new set of dates after Romaine, or?
Yes, because we had an opportunity. There used to be a set of stone steps going over the tail of the serpent, and I wanted to remove those for a long time. And we removed those steps, and it exposed intact mound. So we thought this is an opportunity. So we took a bulk sample of that, floated some of it, and got charcoal, and also did a soil humates date, and got new dates that way that were older than Adena, but the soil humates date was a little bit older than we thought, but it was still would have been in what we've called the late woodland period rather than the Fort Ancient culture. But the dates were more or less confirmed that it's not Adena, it's probably, but they're not definitive. I think we had really good dates with the particles that we got from the intact mound, 96. And it mostly corroborated that.
So you corroborated your dates from the 90s with these recent dates from the stairs that you had to, excavated. And Romaine and colleagues published their dates in 2017, 2018. So for the reader or for the listener that's out there, Romaine and colleagues with their bulks radiocarbon dates claim Serpent Mound is dated to 2,000 years ago. And they took the bulk dates from the soil horizons below the mound. And we know, and I mean, I guess Brad here, who wrote the paper, knows that the A horizon, usually the top soil layers are scraped off. Am I correct?
Yeah,
when they're building the mound, it's one of the yeah. So that's what Putnam wrote. Is so Romaine and colleagues not only took bulk dates, but they took it from soil horizons below the mound, which we know the soil horizon below the mound, there could have been, the youngest ones could have been removed. Am I correct?
Yes.
And Putnam at least claims that.
Yeah. Okay. And our excavations also, the excavation we did in 91 also showed that there was no A horizon beneath the mound.
Okay. So I think that you have two dates, and in my experience, having charcoal, by the way, is how I've dated all the tough sites, is sieving for charcoal. By the way, have you used a little bit of hydrogen peroxide on the soil? If you use like 7% hydrogen peroxide, it breaks down like those humic acids, and it basically disaggregates the sediment.
Yeah.
And it bleaches all the non-charcoal organic matter. So when you sieve it, basically the dark black stuff will be the charcoal or any mineral matter, but you can just get rid of that with the sieve, the fine coarse stuff. And you can then count it. If you sieve it into like a little dish, you can just use microscope to count or pick the dates right out of there. But I think hydrogen peroxide diluted with water is an amazing way to disaggregate and look for dates. And I've never had issues. Some people are worried about adding peroxide to the dates, but I've never had any issue. And I've talked to the people at the Radiocarbon lab who don't think that's an issue. But anyway, don't want to get lost in that. So you did charcoal dating from two different time periods two different studies, let's say, and they correspond with about 1,000 years ago, corresponding with this so-called Fort Ancient culture. Correct, right? And when would you say the Serpent Mound, the youngest date or youngest age versus the oldest? What's like a time window?
Well, they date to 1100 AD. Both samples dated to that.
Okay, they both came to about the same. They calibrated to that age.
The
right
two
around the
dates
same
we
age.
got in 1911 were both, I don't remember the plus and minus, but they were both 920, and the plus and minuses were identical.
That's remarkable. And that's consistent with some other evidence that some of these mounds were built fairly rapidly, right?
Yeah.
Like I know Monk's Mound, I know Monk's Mound is a totally different culture, or, it's around the same time, but
yeah,
it's a flat top mound, but it was built fairly rapidly, right?
Well,
like
I don't know that much about
it.
I don't know that much about Cahokia, so.
Okay, yeah, maybe let's not get into speculation because we'll be held to account when it's on the record. But I think I know there's additions added on, so you could split hairs on that point. Yeah. But I think they cored Monk's Mound and they looked at the pollen, and it was actually seems to be the majority of it was built fairly, maybe over a course of a year. And so I just think that's maybe something to bring up, that these mounds were maybe built, even though they're huge, massive, built with baskets and clamshell hose. They were built pretty fast. And so that, I think, that provides a little bit of insight into how well and how much dedication and organization there was to go about to build something like this, like Serpent Mound. Okay, so we're talking about 1100 AD is when you're thinking, or the dating is consistent with 1100 AD. And then in 2020, you kind of pulled up some more information, which I think is interesting and worthwhile to discuss, because the serpent, why would they create a serpent mound? Why is a serpent important in 1100 AD, Ohio, Midwest America, or what would become Midwest America? You say if you look around at other contemporary artwork in the Midwest, for example, Picture Cave in Missouri, for those people that don't know, Google it, because it is probably one of the most important indigenous art left here in North America. It's all these motifs and basically pictures of people and gods and other things from about the same time period as the construction of Serpent Mound. And so, Brad, what did they find at that Picture Cave and other place that would suggest, why the serpent's important and why they would be building something like that?
Okay, well, let me take like a step back. Serpent Mound is usually characterized as a serpent with an egg in its mouth. But other surveyors that looked at that site at an early day found that there was much more to it than that there was a wishbone-shaped mound on the other side of the oval. So it was a much more complicated feature at the head. So whether that's an egg or something even in the animal's jaws, or maybe it's a representation of the open jaws, or maybe it's something entirely different. So there was three components to this: a serpent, an oval, and a wishbone-shaped mound. And I was perusing this, beautiful coffee table book on Picture Mound with pictures of the caves. And I came across a panel, and it jumped out at me because in close association was a serpent, an oval, and a kind of a wishbone-shaped mound that was more obviously, in this case, either like a human with splayed legs. And I'm looking at that picture going, wow, these are the three elements in slightly different configuration that we see at Serpent Mound. And the two of the authors of that book, Carol Diaz-Granados and James Duncan, were going to be coming to Ohio State University to give a guest lecture. And I made copies of the Serpent Mound map by John McLean that showed these other features and the picture cave panel. And after the talk, I went up to him and said, "Hi, can I, I introduced myself and, could I show you something?" And I showed this to them and they were like, "Wow." And I said, "Because I was thinking this is the same elements of the same story. What do you think?" And they said, "Yeah." So we have subsequently published a number of papers together that say these places, the Missouri cave art, which is, picture cave, they say is like the Dagiasuan creation epic is portrayed in, sort of like in the Maya Popol Vuh. This is the Dagiasuan creation story. And what I'm pointing to is that the serpent and the oval and the wishbone shape corresponds to that panel in Serpent Cave that the Dagiasu that they have consulted with interpret as the great serpent, the lord of the underworld, mating with first woman, who lives on the moon, and she is a supernatural being. But by mating with the great serpent, she acquires the power to create all life on Earth. So what my team thinks that the Serpent Mound represents is the serpent, first woman, and the oval is her exaggeratedly large vulva, which in Dagiasuan tradition is where the sun sets. It's a portal to the beneath world. And that's why it may be enlarged in that way. And there was a stone platform inside the oval on which there was much burning. And if you go from like the neck of Serpent Mound, where the sort of the jaws converge at the neck, and sight across that stone platform on which probably offerings were burned, you're looking directly at where the sun sets on the summer solstice. And the sun was believed to set into the vulva of first woman. So all this Dagiasuan interpretations and iconography seem to come together to say, and it's contemporary with 1100 AD with this. Some of those stories probably came out of Cahokia. And so we think Picture Cave, that panel, and Serpent Mound are all telling this pivotal key moment in the Dagiasuan creation story of when first woman requires the power to create life. And we're not saying that Dagiasu necessarily built Serpent Mound, although Dagiasu are Eastern Sioux. They do have a connection with the Ohio Valley, and maybe they did build it. But there are also other connections. It may be a more widespread story. For example, the Shawnee are like the only Algonquian tribe that have a female creator in their stories. And they also have a snake clan. So perhaps the Shawnee just haven't recorded their traditions or saved them because of historical circumstances as faithfully as the Dagiasuan have. So it may be this an earlier, more widespread version of a story. So I can't say the Shawnee built it, or I can't say the Dagiasuan built it, but traditions that are common to both of those cultures, I think, lie at the heart of that symbolism.
Interesting. Are there any other serpent mounds, even smaller ones that you know about?
There are smaller ones. There are stone serpent effigies in the valley below the Fort Ancient earthworks. They're called the Kern effigies. And they're not sinuous, so they're not obviously a snake. They have a gentle arc, but they're made out of stone, and the tails look like big rattlesnake tails with slabs built to create that. And the archaeologist who excavated them, John White, the late John White, found that if you put a gnomon pole at the head, when the sun on the summer solstice rises, the shadow of the pole determines the path of that serpent. And there are other kind of stone serpent effigies like that in Kentucky. And I think at least one of those has been dated to the Fort Ancient culture. And John White dated the Kern effigies to the Fort Ancient culture. So solstice-aligned serpent effigies belong to the Fort Ancient culture.
Okay, and this is interesting. There's this, you're suggesting both this cultural, iconographic connection between the Fort Ancient and these maybe like Mississippian sites to the south. Yeah,
yes.
So this whole almost big, and for the people that are watching that are completely unfamiliar, maybe can you describe the Mississippians? They're contemporaneous with the Fort Ancient culture. and
Yeah.
maybe the Mississippians, Cahokia. Maybe talk a little bit about who they are and how they connect with this Fort Ancient culture.
Yeah, because Dr. Robert Cook at Ohio State University thinks there's a real connection here. So Cahokia is kind of like the largest city in America. It's sort of the epitome of Mississippian civilization. It had all these giant temple mounds and other kinds of mounds. Maybe 20,000 people lived in this city, and it was ruled by a king. And there are other big Mississippian centers in the Mississippi Valley and in the Southeast, as you referred to. But Cahokia seems to be where it starts. It's where this particular kind of art style that's represented in Picture Cave begins. It's a great civilization for its time. At its time, it was a larger city than either contemporary London or Paris. So tremendous civilization. The Mississippian civilization never appears in Ohio. So there are no Cahokias in Ohio. We've got these large Fort Ancient villages. But Rob Cook and a co-author of his have determined that one of the reasons that Cahokia collapses is because there are huge droughts in the Mississippi Valley, and there aren't droughts in the Ohio Valley. So he's seeing at places like Sunwatch Village in Dayton and other Fort Ancient sites, massive Mississippian influence as refugees from Cahokia are coming into the Ohio Valley. And that could be that sort of Mississippian influence from Cahokia and effigy mound influence from the effigy mound culture in Wisconsin. They sort of invent the idea of telling stories with mounds. All this converges on the Fort Ancient culture, and they create Serpent Mound as kind of a synthesis of artistic traditions from the Mississippian, mound building from the upper Midwest of animal shapes, and then telling these mythic stories through mounds.
So that drought idea I've worked on at Cahokia. I haven't heard about this idea from Cook. So you're suggesting almost like a dipole, or there's a dry area over Cahokia, and then the eastern part of the Ohio River watershed was wet during this drought. But I know from my work at Horseshoe Lake using oxygen isotopes and carbonates from a lake just north of Monk's Mound, the shift to dry conditions in the lake happens around, in the late 1200s to the 1300s.
Okay, so that's after Serpent Mound was built then.
Yeah, but I think you see it's Sterling. But when I say these, there's an error of 30 to 40 to 50 years on each date. I say, if I say 1100, I know, but just for people out there. But yeah, we see there's a shift to wet conditions. It's published in scientific reports. And I'm trying to remember all these dates off the top of my head, but it was around 1100 AD. It actually is wet in Horseshoe Lake. And then that kind of corresponds to this explosion in the population from 1050 to 1100. And then the Sterling phase is 1100 to 1200 at Cahokia. And that's supposedly the cultural apex of the site. Then 1200, we see this decentralization the site. And then it's not considered fully abandoned. Well, this is debated too, when you get down to the semantics. It wasn't fully abandoned until like 13 to 1400, like 1300 to 1350, I think, is the Sand Prairie phase, is when they think more or less is abandoned. But so what I'm trying to say is by 1200, I feel like if that's the decentralization period, is that overlapping with your dates from, this movement of people up to the Eastern Ohio watershed away from the Midwest. And then, maybe driving them to, like you're saying, memorialize the traditions and religions. And I'll let you talk, but then it still comes down to why. So you're thinking, is it the dryness? Is it this drought? Is this tumultuous period that's leading them to create this beautiful piece of art? What do you think?
It may be, because the ancient indigenous cosmology that covers pretty much all of North and South America, it's a 3-layered cosmos. And sometimes it's much more complicated than that. Sometimes it's 9 layers or 12 layers. But you can think of it as just 3. There's the sky world, ruled by the thunderbird spirits. And then there's the middle world that humans and animals live in. and then there's the beneath world. And the rulers of the beneath world are either both the great horned serpent and the underwater panther, or one or the other, depending on the tradition. And so the watery underworld are the spirits you would pray to for bringing rain to the crops, because those were the serpents, the beings, the supernatural beings in charge of that. And so if you were experiencing a drought, you would be turning to the underworld spirits for their influence, praying for them to bring rain or something like that. So it makes sense that you would build a shrine to the great serpent as part of this wanting to be preserved from droughts, wanting to ensure that the rains continue to come. And maybe entire world renewal ceremonies took place there, where you're wanting the sun to come back from the summer solstice so that it will continue to shine on the crops, and the rain will continue to fall so that the crops will be fed. But that connection seems to make a great deal of sense.
Well, just looking at the site, I try to imagine when I go to those sites or look at them, they must have felt that it was very important to make that, to go to the effort to have put it together, that the motivating factor was very important for them. Just the organization, the scale of it is just so massive that you would have to have that kind of consensus among the people in order to get them to make something like that.
Yeah. And in Ohio,
would you say? Yeah.
Yeah. And in Ohio, we only have 2 animal-shaped mounds that I think are really certainly animal-shaped mounds. We have the Great Serpent Mound, and then in the central Iowa, we have what's called Alligator Mound, which I think is an underwater panther, not an alligator. I mean, and in Wisconsin, you have thousands of animal-shaped mounds. So we are sort of in that we have, like, Serpent Mound is probably the largest and most elegantly designed animal-shaped mound, in the world, but more of them are up in Wisconsin. So that's why I think there's an influence coming in from there, but it doesn't catch on. We only have these 2 in Ohio. But yes, the scale of Serpent Mound in particular, people must have thought these underworld spirits, like the serpent, like the alligator, were hugely important and needed to be evoked and prayed to in their ceremonies.
Now that you bring it up, like, Ohio is not really known for mounds. There's those ones in Iowa. The Wisconsin's known for all these effigy mounds, but then there's 2 in Ohio, and one is among the biggest and most complex. And so there's this alligator mound. Is it dated to the Fort Ancient culture? Has anyone worked on that?
Yeah, that's in Licking County, right next to the Newark Earthworks. I was able to excavate a trench into the shoulder, the armpit, and we've got charcoal that was embedded in the floor of the mound that dates to a little bit later than Serpent Mound. So that we determined very, very early on, and that's like chunks of charcoal embedded in the floor. So I don't think we could get better dates than that.
I would agree. Charcoal is the best way to date sediments, soil. So let it be known to everyone out there. Unless you can find some embedded material. I worked a lot on the old copper cultures up along Lake Superior, and you'll find rope and wood still embedded in the copper, because copper, when it weathers, it weathers these oxides that preserve organic material. So you could still find wooden shafts in these like archaic projectile points. It's crazy up there, and take dates right from the actual material, string, wood. It's amazing, but you don't get to find that. And this, I guess this brings up the point of dating in a place like Ohio. To date, for people that don't know, radiocarbon, you need organic material, you need carbon. That kind of material does not last very long in a wet, seasonal climate like Ohio. And so to find bits and pieces of organic material that are suitable for dating is sometimes difficult, because you'll just have like the chert arrowhead or the piece of ceramic pottery or something along those lines. But charcoal is nice because we know it can be produced by humans, and it's pure carbon. So there's a lot of carbon in there, and it's very, very stable over time, even in wet conditions. It can last thousands of years. So it makes excellent dating material for any geologists or archaeologists tuning in. Don't do bulk dates. Not good. Not good at all. Okay, and then so we get back to the mounds and who built them, and there might be this idea that they could be refugee people that have moved because of droughts from the central part, and that's just some idea, and it's consistent with the iconography. Why? Oh, and when you brought up the alligator mound or crocodile, why would in Ohio would they make a crocodile or an alligator mound? Can
Well,
you?
that's what's interesting. And
That's
I have a footnote to the paper that I published with a geomorphologist colleague in which it's complete speculation. It's sort of a just so story that Squire and Davis mapped the alligator, and they have the alligator in quotation marks. And they say, we don't know why the local people call it the alligator because it doesn't look like an alligator. It's got a little round head and a curling tail. But that's what they call it. But then it occurred to me that hundreds of years previous, it's early 1800s when Europeans are first coming into the country. Indigenous people are there. They encounter this mound and they ask the indigenous person, what is this? And if that person says, and if it was an underwater panther, they say, well, I know the Ojibwe word. That's Mishipeshu. And the Europeans are sort of struggling with the language and they go, underwater panther. Panthers don't live in the water. What do you mean? And he says, well, it's that big sort of monster that lives in the water with a long tail and sometimes eats people. And the European goes, you mean an alligator? And so if that actually happened, and someday I'd like to find a diary or a letter that describes that, that would explain why the Europeans were so convinced it was an alligator, because that's what they thought they had been told by the local indigenous people. And that's why they stuck to their story, even Squire and Davis point out to them that it's clearly not an alligator.
Okay. That makes sense. It is strange, also too, that the two, things that are constructed, earthworks are, maybe an alligator, underwater panther, Mishipeshu, and a snake. And there's a rock snake nearby. But then I'm in Wisconsin, things are like more like birds, bear, deer. Like what I'm trying to get at is prey animals, things that you would think, not prey animals, animals that are important for our diet, humans. I guess people can eat snakes, can eat alligators, maybe underwater panthers, but they're just, I don't feel like they're as important to, food. So that to me, again, suggests like slightly different origins of the people that are building these in the Ohio area itself.
Yeah. They're not as common, but they do have some serpent effigy mounds, and some of them are like these perfectly straight mounds that they sort of interpret as probably serpents. But,
okay.
Yeah.
I'm just picturing that. There's that marching bears site. That's Iowa, though, right?
Yeah, that's
and then
National Monument.
Okay, and there's I remember seeing a big bird, like with wide. I think, is that still an effigy? Monument.
And I think, I'm not sure if that's, because I'm thinking of all of the mounds, but yeah, I think you're right. Mm-hmm. Bears and birds are some of the most common things, and as well as
most common.
Yeah.
And then you have this big, huge serpent here eating something, or has a portal, or in its mouth. And then you mentioned that it could line up with the solstice, and this kind of ties in with a celestial event. Can you again explain that a little bit more?
Well, the head of the serpent,
your idea.
Yeah, mm-hmm. The head of the serpent seems definitely to have an alignment to the summer solstice on the sunset. There are three principal curves of the body that some people have said one's lined up to the summer solstice sunrise, one's lined up to the equinox, and the other's lined up to the winter solstice sunrise. And that does kind of work. But in those cases, the sight lines are so short, and there's not a really obvious back sight. So there's a lot of fudge factor involved. And it's not made any better by the fact that some people have said, oh, no, it's not aligned to the sun, it's aligned to the moon. And the northern coil is lined up to the northernmost rise of the moon, and the middle coil is to the midpoint, and the other coil is to the southernmost rise of the moon. those are very different alignments, and it just shows you the amount of fudge factor when you just have a short, area without, a real precise alignment. How if you just move one a little bit to the left, you can make it be one alignment, move a little bit to the right, and you make it the other. So I think, given the importance of solstice alignments for serpents that we know about, then those coils probably, or those curves of the body probably are lined up to the sun, but it's just not precise enough for me to say, yes, they were. It's not like the head alignment.
Yeah. Okay. And I've always felt that way when you hear about these alignments, here to here to here, and there's a triangle, and look at, they did circles in Utah, and they did circles over in Scotland, and see, circles were, cultural transmission, not a universal symbol. But, some people like on Netflix are speculating that the alignment of like Serpent Mound, lines up with the way the sun was 13,000 years ago during the Younger Dryas, if I remember correctly. That seems like weak evidence. Would you say, like, just speculating on the alignments is evidence for a construction of a site?
Well, and it's because that person was looking at the wrong alignment. So he got the alignment wrong. He was thinking it's just sort of the whole general alignment of the head, and it's really not. It's the point of the neck with the stone mound. So it's actually a little bit off of the alignment this other person is looking at. So he's got the alignment wrong. And even if he was right, because he claims that he's not disrespecting the indigenous people, but he thinks that the Serpent Mound was originally built 13,000 years ago, and it's subsequently been kept and rebuilt by later indigenous cultures. And that's why it has these different dates. But if that's the case, then, and the alignment is wrong now, it means, which he's wrong about to begin with, but if accepting his scenario, it means indigenous people have had no idea what it was supposed to be aligned to, and they've just been slavishly recreating the original design, which certainly takes something away from the indigenous people and their agency and their ideas of what the site should be aligned to.
Okay. And that's interesting way to look at it too. And another thing I'm thinking right off the bat as a geologist is, where's the ice sheet in 13,000 years ago?
Yeah, we're not.
Like, isn't it right north? It's not glaciated.
It's close, but yeah, the Ross County down in southern Ohio was never glaciated, so we don't have that issue. But the ice sheets would have been somewhat near.
Yeah, so 13,000 years ago, you would have been basically Arctic conditions. There probably would have been very few oak trees, let's put it that way, around the tip of the ice sheet. And to find charcoal in the mound made of white oak suggests burning oak trees in a temperate forest, or deciduous forest.
There could have been 13,000 years ago. In the last glacial maximum is like at 22,000. So that was its closest approach. By 13,000 years ago, the ice is much further to the north. So there very well could be.
Yeah. I guess I see what you're saying. But I think it still would have been in the Lake Erie Basin. I believe, that's still far. Yeah, you're right. That's far north. But it would have been substantially different climate, we can at least say. Whether or not oak trees had made it that far, I guess I'd have to look into the literature too. But a huge amount of time for people to keep rebuilding this Serpent Mound, and the alignment would have been off after so many thousands of years. So yeah, it's interesting. And what else, like, when it comes down to, this, like, people talking, these popular shows on Netflix where they cover Serpent Mound using just their own logic, I guess. What have you encountered? What kind of confusion do you think this is having or public discourse around Serpent Mound? I mean, is it suggesting the age is too old and, throwing off the chronology of indigenous people, or is it just undermining science itself? how do we as scientists go about addressing people that have their own ideas about how things form and a big microphone? What do you think we should do to bring our voices up, allow them to actually become part of the debate? If you want to call it a debate.
Sure. Well, it is.
Yeah.
I mean, and I think the biggest problem is that all of these crazy notions, ancient astronauts, giants built the mounds, or it was built by this lost advanced civilization. All of them essentially take away the indigenous people from the equation, that the indigenous people were somehow too stupid, too savage to have done this. It's the classic mound builder myth that it must have been a white civilization because only white people are smart enough to do this, or an alien civilization because they're smarter than everybody else. And I think the best way to counter it, I think the reason these myths formed is because of the Indian Removal Act and everything that led up to it, when all the indigenous people in Ohio were removed from the landscape and sent out to Kansas and Oklahoma. And so, I mean, school kids like me growing up in the 60s were told the Indians were all dead. They were gone. There were no Indians, but they have their own thriving culture out in Oklahoma, but they're not here. So they don't have a voice here. And I think if we can bring young Indigenous American Indian interns to come in and work at these sites and to be interpreters, I mean, it will add a level of authenticity. That how can you look at this indigenous person and say, no, your ancestors didn't build it. Some giant built it or some ancient alien built it. So I don't necessarily think all our science will have as strong an effect as that would be, including indigenous voices and indigenous people at these sites to help provide the interpretation, science, and their own traditions. These stories come from our traditions. They're not, from Atlantis. They're not from Mars, whatever. These are our traditions.
Interesting. Yeah. I like that answer. They're bringing in the indigenous voice and adding that level of authenticity, because in a place like Ohio, there aren't any Native American reservations, right? Pennsylvania, same thing. And there's a little one up in a few small ones in upstate New York. But if you grow up in Pennsylvania, Ohio in the last 50 years or 100 years, it's completely devoid of any indigenous history remnant beyond a few signs. So it highlights that it's even more important that we have people that are willing to go and talk about the history of the site and bring it to life, what was going on there. Like these stories you're telling me right now, I mean, it's amazing. Even if they are, like the migration for the drought, that maybe to some degree a little bit speculative, but still that adds a little bit of depthness to the history and the struggles and the things people have overcome and like what they've held as important and what they held sacred. To me, that those kind of stories, even if I'm non-indigenous, but I just want to just try to understand how people thought back then. Like that's my interest in getting sources that are indigenous to help me on this path, and other people to like learn, even scholarly people too, about what these stories in places like Serpent Mound have to tell.
Yeah, and even if you take the drought off the table because maybe the data don't align, you still have Cahokia sending out like missionaries, like I think it was at the Trempealeau Mounds or something in Wisconsin that are thought to be an outlier. And if people are coming in, missionaries are coming into Ohio and sharing those kinds of stories, you can get the influence that way, just sort of naturally from that spread of that influence.
Okay. And I think you're talking about Aztalan in Wisconsin.
Aztalan, that's what it is.
Aztalan. That site is wild because this is another one, the Trempealeau Mounds. I've never known how to say that word.
Yeah, I don't either.
I think is one of those that is the dating is whether or not it's Mississippian or Hopewell or Adena. Do not know the literature, but I remember reading a long time back that it's debated whether or not it's Adena.
I was thinking of Aztalan, so yeah.
Aztalan is for sure It has flat top mounds. It's definitely like whatever happened to Cahokia went out like missionary style and resettled. Like new religious icons show up in areas and different style pottery and arrowheads that are all tied to like that central Mississippi or floodplain near Cahokia. Chunky, the spread of chunky, if I remember correctly, starts in Cahokia and just spreads all over, suggesting, that's an easy indicator of a cultural movement, of cultural idea. Where's it going to go? Up in Aztlan, I completely lost my train of thought.
Sorry about that.
Where were we at, though?
Well,
this is all good.
One of the things that I thought that we haven't quite touched on yet is the idea that if we started going there, I think when we were talking about the importance of serpents, that it must have been an important symbol. And if it was, it should be represented in the broader cultural context. And we indeed find that in the Fort Ancient culture and the Mississippian culture. Serpents are hugely abundant in jewelry and as motifs on pottery and all kinds of things. In the Adena, they're almost completely absent. And Bill Romaine, in one of the papers, and I was astonished at this argument, he said, well, so what? You can have something that's deeply religious, like, say, Jesus and Muhammad, and images of them were never reproduced in their lifetimes. And of course, you're not allowed to produce images of Muhammad now as because of the Muslim religion. And I was like, he actually put that argument in his paper. And it's like, okay, but if a culture has a prohibition against making graven images of serpents, they're not going to build Serpent Mound.
Yeah, interesting.
So whoever built Serpent Mound, they certainly had no prohibition against creating serpent effigies.
Okay, and also going back to the drought idea, I want to state for the record, I do think I am of the camp, and my research does support a drought at the end of Cahokia, the abandonment. I don't think, this is the wording issue, whether or not it causes it or it incentivizes it or it coincides, but there was a severe drought detected, or a shift to drier conditions overall during the end of the Little Ice Age at our site at Horseshoe Lake from like about 1200 to 1350. So the shift to dry was about 12 to 1350 with the air in there. I mean, I know you mentioned your dates are around 1100, but to me, if I was interpreting this, I would say that corresponds with the drought to me. So I just want to emphasize that I don't think what I meant is speculation because we weren't really there when people were actually leaving the valleys. But I do think I think the drought idea is supported by not only my research, but tree ring evidence and evidence up in northern Indiana at other lakes with Broxton Bird. So there is some degree, I think, of corroborating evidence for this drought near the end of the Mississippi culture. And for the people that don't know, and I don't think we've even talked about this, but Fort Ancient culture, Mississippians, they are heavily dependent on agriculture. Cultigens include maize, squash, sunflowers, beans. And so they were very dependent on summer season precipitation for their crops. This kind of links the drought to their society with some sort of mechanism, let's say. So I think, I think it does, the drought idea and linking it to the serpent is really, really, it's interesting. Yeah. But there is some issue too with the drought because people out there have thrown other things, in the mix, like the floods, this great flood that hit Cahokia around the apex of the Sterling. At the apex of Cahokia, there's a mega flood in the lake nearby, which is the disturbance layer from the erosion of the watershed around the lake. I mean, it's a huge site. But people have thrown this flood idea. Have you heard of the flood idea?
Not
at the end of Cahokia?
No, I mean,
it was about a couple of years ago. Yeah, coring at two lakes on the Ohio or along the Mississippi, they find this anomalous layer dated to the Mississippian period, and I find it too in the same lake. And they speculate that this layer must have been the remnants of a gigantic or large-scale flood that inundated both sites at 1200 AD during the apex of, and there's no evidence for it in the archaeological record whatsoever. It's on a floodplain, by the way, which floods all the time. So I don't know how you'd have an anomalous flood in a floodplain, because it by itself, it doesn't make sense just to say it like that. Yeah, so the drought, I do want to say there's competing ideas out there, and I want to be balanced and make sure everyone knows. And those are in peer review. They're not on Netflix. I'm surprised our friends have not linked onto the flood destroying Cahokia.
Yeah, you'd think
okay, so just throwing it out there. It's like I couldn't believe when I was listening. Don't really watch the ancient. I think they're called the Ancient Apocalypse series on. Yeah. I've seen a few of the episodes. I watched the one on Serpent Mound specifically, and I've seen interviews and stuff. I guess we just say his name, Graham Hancock. It's just awkward now.
Yeah, sorry.
I didn't want to have to I don't want this to be about Graham Hancock. That's the biggest issue. The thing I wanted with this talk is this is not about Graham Hancock, but I guess he's sort of the elephant in the room. So we should just introduce that he is the Netflix creator who has gone around and reinterpreted a lot of ancient sites in the world according to his own narrative. And even if it goes against what the experts and people that actually constructed the sites say. But I will say that he has gotten people enthusiastic about ancient prehistoric history of America. He does at least claim that he is not a scientist. He does say he's a journalist and a writer, a fiction writer, maybe. So I will say that I do appreciate the enthusiasm that he's garnered for ancient history of all things, which I would say to my friends, like, how you would have thought a Netflix special on prehistoric America could be like number one. And I mean, he raised the possibility that if this could happen, but it's just unbelievable when you go and you listen. And like the Serpent Mound one, which is the one I did watch, where he just was there and he talks about the alignment 13,000 years ago during the Younger Dryas. And what I noticed is from the bits and pieces I've watched is he confuses speculation with evidence. He just speculates. And he does even, I think in an interview, mentions that if all the speculation, if you have like stacks and stacks of speculation, if it all points to one direction, it's some kind of evidence of something. And I would say that you don't have evidence of anything. Evidence is evidence. One piece of evidence of solid evidence negate millions of speculations. Doesn't matter. You can stack up all the speculation you want with one solid piece of evidence. It could go away. And so that, I think, is something people need to think about when they're watching these shows. Is this speculation or is this evidence? Radiocarbon dates are evidence. Alignments with the sun, like you said, it's kind of hard in the moon. That is speculation. There is no way to prove whether or not that's true. And so do you have any thoughts on that and how people can go about, that have been excited by Graham Hancock's work and his series on Netflix? How can they go about critically, analytically watching this and at the same time keeping an open mind?
Yeah, it's so hard. I mean, there's always that quip that, you should have an open mind, but not so open that your brain falls out. But also, I think a lot of the attraction of these feeds into sort of a strong anti-intellectual, anti-science seeming movement almost in our country, so that having this guy out there saying the scientists are wrong is what makes it an interesting story for a lot of people. And I don't understand that.
I see what you're saying. So he's almost like, he's like the guy, he's like the advocate for people that think science has led them astray or something. And he's like, they're wrong. Yeah.
Yeah, he's the
So that is,
iconoclast. He's got the truth, and we're just trying to hide things. It's like the people that say that the Smithsonian and the Ohio History Connection has giant skeletons in our basement that we got from the mounds that we're hiding because we don't want people to know the Bible was true and there were giants in the earth in those old days. But then when I
yeah,
can talk on people sort of what I want to say, why on earth would I do that? In the Ohio Historical Society, the Ohio History Connection is always trying to get, more money. If we had giant skeletons and we could put them on display, we'd make millions. People would be lining up out there. Why wouldn't we do that? And they say, oh,
yeah,
no, that you'd have to rewrite the textbooks then. I say, yeah, but I'd get to rewrite the textbooks. My picture would be on National Geographic. Why wouldn't I do that? Just because I'm
yeah.
supposed to be committed to the big archaeology narrative? That's absurd if anybody knows anything about it.
Yeah, the big archaeology. That is hilarious. I love that one. If anyone knew how little resources American archaeology runs on, it's unbelievable. It's
Yeah.
unbelievably low. I mean,
Yeah.
just, yeah. And to say that that's like the big archaeology is, and we're doing this stuff to get our big grants from NSF and like state history groups. Like, okay, this is funny. So yeah. And this giants thing too is something that's consistent with you see it so much. And it does go back. If you do go back in the old newspapers, when they dug up these bones, and I'm sure you're familiar with these stories, putting in railroads and stuff, they would often claim in the newspapers, they were giants. The femurs were bigger than everybody at the site, and they must have been 7 feet tall. And they were for sure in newspapers, those stories. And I think that was like, I found them dated to the late 1800s in like Erie's newspapers, Erie, Pennsylvania, my hometown. When they put in the railroad tracks, said the same exact thing. They found skeletons. They must have been giants. But then that's the 1870s and 80s. And those stories, I don't know how they could still persist, but I guess we still debate somewhat jokingly about flat Earth. And so like Copernicus solved that one like in the 15 or 1600s. And so if we're still on that, I guess we have no hope for some people.
Well, the ancient Greeks
Yeah.
said that
So
worked out.
did the ancient? Yeah, somebody worked that
Yeah.
one out a long time. We've been over that for a while, but yeah,
Yeah.
we're still somehow online. And a lot of this, I wonder if it exists just online. And I get this with not just this subject, but with like a lot of like discourse, politics, and our impressions of what's out there now is kind of comments online. And like, are we getting a true representation of what's out there? I like to say that we're not, but I also don't do X, formerly known as Twitter, but I
Yeah.
do have YouTube and I do Instagram, and I do see, and I personally have come upon it. I've done work on the old copper culture, who Graham Hancock early on, talks about this secret journey from Europe to mine this copper that's been lost, like during the Phoenicians or some Bronze Age. And I've encountered this when I do field work, emails, if I had a couple press releases come out for articles and comments on there. It's just remarkable how persistent this idea and like it just sticks with people. And what I often hear is oh yeah, those Native American copper mines in Michigan. Yeah, I heard the Indians, but I also heard there was like a secret journey maybe from Europe, and like that's on the side, like that's like the secret stuff they don't want you to really know about. And then I'm familiar with the whole thing, so stay patient with people and stuff. But I see that all the time, and it is this like underdog kind of. I'm seeing the real side of science that they don't want you to know. So there is a degree of that. Yeah, maybe this anti-intellectualism, or it's maybe like anti-university science. Like if it emerges out of universities, they don't like it because I don't want to say anti-intellectual or maybe not anti-curiosity because they're clearly curious. Maybe let's say. hopefully motivated by the right reasons. But they just think that science is captured by something and that it's misleading. And maybe in some other fields now, I'm trying to, empathize here. Maybe there was some degree of bad science that has misled the public in the past in other fields of study, let's say. But yeah, this big money-making scheme of archaeology is out there to hide the real truth of America. Is just so bogus. And when you, Brad, and when you are part of the big archaeology, so I am talking to you. And when you're in the conspiracy, you realize, holy crap, this is a really bad conspiracy.
Yeah.
Like, I really wish, if I was in this conspiracy, I wish I was getting paid more or something so I can at least say it's worth it. Because it's, yeah. All right. Well, do you have anything else or anything you think we should touch on or talk about before we wrap this up? I think I kind of got everything I wanted.
I think we covered all the bases.
I really just wanted to get at this Serpent Mound. So it was dated with charcoal material found in the actual mound that was recovered over in reproducible, and it dates to about 1100 AD during the Fort Ancient culture, and that is a very interesting time period for Ohio,
Yes.
considering the fact that it's just like kind of anomaly out there. But if you consider, the history that we just barely have an inkling of what happened, in that centuries leading up to 1100 AD and after that, suggests that maybe there is some reorganization, let's say, in the Midwest during that time period that might have provided the impetus to create Serpent Mound. And like you mentioned, the Serpent Mound is serpents coming from the underworld, the wet world. If you're struggling with drought or dry conditions, maybe, calling to the serpents and, dedicating this mound to the serpents, constructing it was part of this response to the drought and maybe remediating it, would you say? So that's super interesting. And the Romain and colleagues who have also dated, they did the bulk dates. So the bulk dates can include tons of contamination. And not only that, they took it from soil horizons below the mound. And we know that the A horizon was removed. So the shallow soil horizons were actually taken off before constructing the mound. And so if you date soil layers below the mound, they're going to be much older than the date of the actual mound, just by logic, without even radiocarbon dating effects taken into account. And if you're watching, if you brought to this channel because you saw it was Serpent Mound and you had heard about it through Netflix and Graham Hancock, I hope that you actually get to see and meet Dr. Brad Lepper here, who is the guy among his colleagues and his team that has worked on dating Serpent Mound. So the veil has been lifted and he is a human being that is right here. And he put together several really nice articles going into all the details about how he did this, along with his work linking the iconography perhaps of the serpent with a picture cave in Missouri, which is a crazy cool site. Look it up. I know it's on private land, so you can't get into it, but man, if that becomes a museum or something, I would love to go check that out. I've been to Cahokia, by the way, Kincaid, Cahokia, Moundville in Alabama, Poverty Point in Louisiana. Been to a lot of different big sites in North America. But I encourage listeners out there, those sites I just listed, go check them out. Those are like big earthen mound, indigenous sites, settlements in some cases in the Midwest that barely, when I was at Poverty Point, I think I was the only one there. And it's in Louisiana. It's this gigantic site of earthen mounds. There's too much to get into there right now. But Monk's Mound at Cahokia is right along the highway that if you're crossing the country, you can almost pull off the highway, take a stop, hike the stairs up Monk's Mound and take a look at the Ohio or the Mississippi floodplain in St. Louis. It's amazing. And You can learn tons about the history of the site while you're there. So there's lots of cool history in America that we need to unveil for the public. We've lost so much. We need to make sure that we preserve this history and support people like Brad who are out there working on bringing this information to light. And for the record, for history. And if you're interested in his work, I'm sure, Brad, you would accept emails if you have questions, perhaps. Okay.
Yeah,
Sorry, I volunteered you. Yeah, if you can always send Brad an email if you have any questions. I'll list his papers that you gave me, sent me earlier in the description of this video. So you can go, I think they're open access. You can download them, read
Two of them
them,
are open
share
access.
them.
Yeah.
2 of them are open access. And if you can't get a hold of them or can't find them on ResearchGate or Google Scholar, if you email Brad or even me, I would be more than willing to help you get the paper you're looking for if I have it. So if you enjoyed our conversation, please like and subscribe to my channel. I'm trying to bring the real scientists behind discoveries on the channel so we can actually see and hear these people and get their story, get their insights into the science that's happening right now. So with that, Brad, do you have any last thoughts?
No, thanks for the invitation to be a part of the program. So thank you.
No problem. Make sure to not to forget, check out Serpent Mound. It is a park open to the public, right, Brad?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So if you're nearby, what's the nearest town? Where's Serpent Mound closest to?
It's close to Peebles, but I suppose it's closest to Cincinnati because it's down in sort of central or central part of the state in the far southern. Adams County is right on the Ohio River, and it's in northern Adams County.
Okay, so yeah, close to Cincinnati, southern Ohio. Cool. You should definitely check out Serpent Mound. I have not been there, surprisingly. That's definitely on my bucket list, though, for sure, to get over and check it out. Maybe next time I'm home, I'll back in Pennsylvania, I'll get down there. So thank you, Brad. I hope you enjoyed the conversation and had the opportunity to get your word out there.
Yep.
Until next time.
Yeah, thanks. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.